What's going on, guys? This is Britta back with the Odin Project, and we are 55% complete of with foundations, but we are going to do Flexbox growing and shrinking. Let's look a little closer at what actually happened when you put Flex 1 on those flex items in the last lesson. This section contains a general overview of topics that you will learn in this lesson. You'll learn the three properties that are defined by the Flex shorthand and how to use them individually. The Flex shorthand. The flex declaration is actually a shorthand for three properties that you can set on a flex item. These properties affect how flex items size themselves within their container. You've seen some shorthand properties before, but we haven't officially defined them yet. Shorthand properties are CSS properties that let you set the values of multiple other CSS properties simultaneously. Using a shorthand property, you can write more concise and often more readable style sheets, saving time and energy. In this case, flex is actually a shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. In the above screenshot, flex 1 equates to flex grow 1, flex shrink 1, flex basis 0. Very often, you see the flex shorthand defined with only one value. In that case, that value is applied to flex grow. So when we put flex 1 on our divs, we're actually specifying a shorthand of flex 110. FlexGrow. FlexGrow expects a single number as its value, and that number is used as flex item's growth factor. When we applied flex 1 to every div inside our container, we were telling every div to grow the same amount. The result of this is that every div ends up the exact same size. If we instead add flex 2 to just one of the divs, then that div would grow to 2 times the size of the others. In the following example, the flex shorthand has values for flex shrink and flex bases, specified with their default values. Let's see what this looks like. Let's contain flex 210. Okay, flex shrink is similar to flex grow but sets the shrink factor of a flex item. Flex shrink only ends up being applied if the size of all flex items is larger than their parent container. For example, if our three divs from above had a width declaration like width 100 pixels and flex container was smaller than 300 pix, our divs would have to shrink to fit. The default shrink factor is flex shrink 1, which means all items will shrink evenly. If you do not want an item to shrink, then you can specify flex shrink 0. You can also specify higher numbers to make certain items shrink at a higher rate than normal. Here's an example. Note that we've also changed the flex basis for reasons that will be explained shortly. If you shrink your browser window, you'll notice that 2 never gets smaller than the given width of 250 pix, even though the flex grow rule would otherwise specify that each element should be equally sized. An important implication to notice here is that when you specify flex grow or flex shrink, flex items do not necessarily respect your given values for width. In the above example, all three divs are given a width of 250 pixels, but when their parent is big enough, they grow to fill it. Likewise, when the parent is too small, the default behavior is for them to shrink to fit. This is not a bug, but it could be confusing behavior if you aren't expecting it. Flex basis simply sets the initial size of a flex item, so any sort of flex growing or flex shrinking starts from that baseline size. The shorthand value defaults to flex basis 0%. The reason we had to change it to auto in the flex shrink example is that with the basis set to 0, those items would ignore the item's width, and everything would shrink evenly. Using auto as a flex basis tells the item to check for a width declaration. Important notes about flex basis. There is a difference between the default of flex basis and the way the flex shorthand defines it if no flex basis is given. The actual default value for flex basis is auto, but when you specify flex 1 on an element, it interprets that as flex 110. If you want to only adjust the flex grow, you can simply do so directly without the shorthand. Or you can be more verbose and use the full 3-value shorthand, flex 11 auto, which is also equivalent to using flex auto. What is flex auto? If you notice, we mentioned a new flex shorthand, flex auto, in the previous note. However, we didn't fully introduce it. Flex auto is one of the shorthands of flex. When auto is defined as a flex keyword, it is equivalent to the values of flex grow 1, flex shrink 1, and flex basis auto, or flex 11 auto using the flex shorthand. Note that flex auto is not the default value when using the flex shorthand despite the name being auto, which may be slightly confusing at first. You will encounter and learn more about flex auto and its potential use cases when reading through the assignment section. In practice, you will likely not be using complex values for flex grow, flex shrink, or flex bases. Generally, you're most likely to use declarations like flex 1 to make divs grow evenly and flex shrink 0 to keep certain divs from shrinking. It is possible to get fancy and set up layouts where some columns relate to each other in a specific ratio, so it's useful to know that you can use other values, but those are relatively rare. Alright, so we got to read W3's flex section, and this MDN doc, and CSS tricks. Alright, so flex section. Basic values of flex. The list below summarizes the effects of the 4 flex values that represent most commonly desired effects. Flex initial, equivalent to flex 01 auto. This is the initial value. Sizes the item based on the width height properties. If the item's main size property computes to auto, this will size the flex item based on its contents. Makes the flex item inflexible when there is positive free space, but it allows it to shrink to its minimum size when there is insufficient space. The alignment abilities or auto margins can be used to align flex items along the main axis. Flex auto, equivalent to flex 11 auto, sizes the item based on the width height properties but makes them fully flexible so that they absorb any free space along the main axis. If all items are either flex auto, flex initial, or flex none, any positive free space after the items have been sized will be distributed evenly to the items with flex auto. Flex none, equivalent to flex 00 auto. This value sizes the item according to the width height properties but makes one flex item fully inflexible. This is similar to initial, except that flex items are not allowed to shrink, even in overflow situations. Flex positive number, equivalent to flex positive number 10, makes the flex item flexible and sets the flex basis to 0, resulting in an item that receives the specified portion of the free space in the flex container. If all items in the flex container use this pattern, their sizes will be proportional to the specified flex factor. By default, flex items won't shrink below their minimum content size, the length of the longest word, or fixed size element. To change this, set the min width or min height property. Okay. The flex CSS shorthand property sets how a flex item will grow or shrink to fit the space available in its flex container. Try it. Flex 1, flex 2, flex 1 30 pixels, flex 1 100 pixels. So okay. This property is a shorthand for the following CSS properties: flex grow, shrink, basis. The flex property may be specified using 1, 2, or 3 values. 1 value syntax: the value must be one of a number. In this case, it is interpreted as flex number 10. The flex shrink value is assumed to be 1, and the flex basis value is assumed to be 0. A width in this case is interpreted as flex 11 width. The flex grow value is assumed to be 1, and the flex shrink value is assumed to be 1. One of the keywords: none, auto, or initial. The first value must be a number, and it is interpreted as flex grow. The second value must be one of a number, then it is interpreted as flex shrink. A valid value for width, then it is interpreted as flex basis. 3 value syntax: the values must be in the following order: a number for flex grow, number for flex shrink, a valid value for width for flex basis. Understanding flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. When you apply a CSS property to an element, there's lots of things going on under the hood. For example, let's say we have some HTML like this, and then we write some CSS. These are technically not the only styles we're applying when we write that one line of CSS above. In fact, a whole bunch of properties will be applied to the child elements here, as if we wrote these styles ourselves. Child, flex, okay. That's weird. Why do these elements have these extra styles applied to them even though we didn't write that code? Well, that's because some properties have defaults that are intended to be overridden by us, and if we don't happen to know these styles are being applied when we're writing CSS, then our layouts can get pretty darn confusing and tough to manage. That flex property above is what's known as a shorthand CSS property, and really what this is doing is setting 3 separate CSS properties at the same time. So what we wrote above is the same as writing this, which essentially is less code. So a shorthand property bundles up a bunch of different CSS properties to make it easier to write multiple properties at once, precisely like the background property where we can write something like this. Body background, top center, no repeat, fixed padding, okay? I try to avoid shorthand properties because they can get pretty confusing, and I often tend to write the longhand versions just because my brain fails to parse long lines of property values. But it's recommended to use the shorthand when it comes to Flexbox, which is weird. That is, until you understand that the flex property is doing a lot of work and each of its sub-properties interact with the others. Also, the default styles are a good thing because we don't need to know what these flex properties are doing 90% of the time. For example, when I use Flexbox, I tend to write something like this: parent, display flex, justify content, space between. I don't even need to care about the child elements or what styles have been applied to them, and that's great. In this case, we're aligning the child items side by side and then spacing them equally between each other. 2 lines of CSS gives you a lot of power here, and that's the neatest thing about Flexbox and those inherited styles. You don't have to understand all the complexity under the hood if you just want to do the same thing 90% of the time. It's remarkably smart because all of that complexity is hidden out of view. But what if we want to understand how Flexbox, including the Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, and Flex Basis properties actually work, and what cool things can we do with them? Just go to the CSS Tricks Almanac. Done. Just kidding. Let's start with a quick overview. Actually, I want to check and see what this is. Oh, looks like this website will be helpful in the future. Okay. These default styles are telling that child element how to stretch and expand. But whenever I see it being used or overridden, I find it helpful to think of these shorthand properties like this. Child flex grow, flex shrink, flex basis. Or child flex max min ideal size. That first value is flex grow and it's set to 0 by default. We don't want our elements to expand at all most of the time. Instead, we want every element to be dependent on the size of the content within it. Here's an example. I've added the content editable property to each child element above, so you can click into it and type even more content. See how it responds? It doesn't actually let me type in there, so we won't worry about that. That's the default behavior of a Flexbox item. Flex grow is set to 0 because we want the element to grow based on the content inside of it. But if we were to change the default of the flex grow property from 0 to 1 like this, then all the elements will take an equal portion of the parent element, but only if the lengths of their content are the same. This is exactly the same as writing flex grow 1 and ignoring the other values because those have been set by default anyway. I think this confused me for such a long time when I started working with flexible layouts. I would see code that would add just flex grow and wonder where the other styles are coming from. It was like an infuriating murder mystery that I just couldn't figure out. Now, if we wanted to make just one of these elements grow more than the others, we just need to do the following. 3-1 auto. And then the third one's grown by 3. Is this weird code to look at even a decade after Flexbox landed in browsers? It certainly is for me. I need extra brain power to say, max min ideal size, but when I'm reading the shorthand, but it does get easier over time. Anyway, in the example above, the first 2 child elements will take up proportionally the same amount of space, but that third element will try to grow up to 3 times the space as the others. Now this is where things get weird because this is all dependent on the content of the child elements. Even if we set flex grow to 3 like we did in this example above and then add more content, the layout will do something odd and peculiar like this, which made it the opposite, made the middle one bigger. That second column is now taking up too much darn space. We'll come back to this later, but for now it's important to remember that the content of a flex item has an impact on how flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis work together. Okay, so for now, flex shrink. Remember that's the second value in the shorthand. Flex shrink tells the browser what the minimum size of an element should be. The default value is 1, which is saying take up the same amount of space at all times. However, if we were to set that value to 0 like this, then we're telling this element not to shrink at all now. Stay the same size, you blasted element, is essentially what this CSS says, and that's precisely what it'll do. We'll come back to this property in a bit once we look at the final value in the shorthand. Flex basis is the last value that's added by default in the flex shorthand, and it's how we tell an element to stick to an ideal size. By default, it's set to auto, which means use my height or width, so when we set a parent element to display flex, we'll get this by default in the browser. Notice how all the elements are the width of their content by default. That's because auto is saying that the ideal size of our element is defined by its content. To make all the elements take up the full space of the parent, we can set the child elements to width 100%, or we can set the flex basis to 100%, or we can set flex grow to 1. Does that make sense? It's weird, huh? It does when you think about it. Each of these shorthand values impact the other, and that's why it's recommended to write this shorthand in the first place rather than setting these values independently of one another. Okay, moving on. When we write something like this, what we're telling the browser here is to set the flex basis to 100 pixels, or please, 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 just try and take up 100 pixels of space. If that's not possible, then the element will take up that much space proportionally to the other elements. You might notice that on smaller screens, this third element is not actually 1,000 pixels. That's because it's really a suggestion. We still have the flex shrink applied, which is telling the element to shrink to the same size as the other elements. Also, adding more content to the other children will still have an impact here. Now, if we wanted to prevent this element from shrinking at all, we could write something like this. Remember, flex shrink is the second value here, and by setting it to 0, we're saying don't shrink ever, you jerk. And so it won't. The element will even break out of the parent element because it'll never get shorter than 1,000 pixels wide. Now, all of this change, if we set flex wrap to the parent element, we'll see something like this. This is because, by default, flex items will try to fit into one line, but flex wrap will ignore that entirely. Now, if those flex items can't fit in the same space, they'll break into a new line. Anyway, this is just some of the ways in which flex properties bump into each other, and why it's so gosh darn valuable to understand how these properties work under the hood. Each of these properties can affect the other, and if you don't understand how one property works, then you sort of don't understand how any of it works at all, which certainly confused me before I started digging into this. But to summarize, try to use the flex shorthand. Remember max, min, and ideal size when doing so. Remember that the content of an element can impact how these values work together too. Alright. Alright, we're going to go ahead and mark this one complete, guys, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.